We're going to be dealing with plot dynamics tonight. That's the second 4 of the 8 essential questions. And what do we mean by dynamics? Everybody knows what plot is. What do we mean by dynamics? Well, dynamics are the forces at work in your story, and those are different than your story points per se. Your story points are like, this is a goal. But whether the goal is achieved or not, that's a dynamic. If it's achieved, you have success. If it's not achieved, that's failure. That's one of the things we'll cover tonight. And although in some respects it's a simple choice, in other respects it's not quite as simple as it might first appear. Also tonight we'll have a number of video clips that we're going to be looking at. Pardon me while I put on my reading glasses. We'll be looking at examples of action-driven stories, examples of decision-driven stories, time lock stories, option lock stories, and then we'll have a group of stories that represent all the different combinations of the story's outcome with success or failure, and the judgment, good or bad. Let's take a look first at the initial one of these plot dynamics, story work. It was originally called story work. In later versions of the Dramatica software, it was changed to story driver, because although this is the kind of work that's done, it's also, being work, what drives the story forward in the plot, and therefore it seemed to make a lot more sense to authors to call it story driver. As a side note, it's important to realize that Dramatica theory is in fact a theory. It's been under development for about 20 years now, and yet it will probably never be finished. It has an accuracy at a certain level of understanding, but there's always more depth to which it can go. There are always new ways to appreciate and interpret the theory, always better ways to explain it. The words that we use in Dramatica to describe elements of the story theory, they're words we came up with to describe what goes on in our own minds psychologically that are represented on screen as the story mind. Again, Dramatica's theory, the key point is that every complete story is an analogy to a single human mind trying to deal with a problem. And all of the characters, plot, theme, and genre represent different families of thought that go on in that mind, made tangible, so the audience can watch the inner workings of its own mind and determine how best to deal with a particular kind of problem that the author is talking about. Now, if indeed stories represent a look from the outside in at our own mind's functions, then we see that those systems exist independently of any language that we use. But in trying to map out what these functions are, how they relate to one another, what the structural story points are, and what the dynamics, like plot dynamics this week, are that move them, change their position, change how they relate one to another, you need to come up with words to describe them. And these words are not always the best choices right off the bat. Or it may be that a word is a perfect choice, but it's a little too hard to understand. In keeping with this, the latest version of Dramatica, which is due out shortly, called Dramatica 4.0, will allow you to have a choice between 2 different sets of terminology. The initial, very accurate, but almost scientific set of terminology that everyone has been using in the software up to this point, sort of Dramatica classic, as it were. And then there's the new version of the language in which about 20 of these terms have been changed to more understandable, easy to grasp, conversational terms. Now, they're not as accurate, but they're a lot easier to begin with. The only danger is that if you start with those terms and someone else is using the old terms, you may not be able to talk to each other, to another author. One of the purposes of Dramatica was to try to come up with a single common language that everyone could be using to talk about story, by clearly identifying every aspect of story structure and story dynamics. However, because it's hard to get to those words, how to grasp them when they're so precise and almost scientific in their accuracy, this other language has now been included. So we hope it doesn't end up creating a Tower of Babel where one person can't talk to another who's even using the Dramatica software. We're hoping that because both are included and you can toggle between one and the other, you'll be able to perhaps start with the easier to use words and then work your way into the greater accuracy of the more difficult words.